Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, Shinsa Songjo Julebun, from idolatrous meat to COVID-19 and back, the new normal era and Pauline ecclesial ethics. First, introduction. After or in the ongoing management of the COVID-19 pandemic, human society will have to come to terms with new social practices and with new ways of interpersonal interaction. Some of the current restrictions will certainly not be abandoned for a long time, if at all. In particular, it can be assumed that currently learned forms of social distancing will be transferred into normal social and group behavior and also into politics and church affairs. It will also have to be asked what significance justified protection against infection, but also irrational forms of demarcation from infected, unvaccinated, or simply unknown persons and groups of persons will have for marking and demarcating one's own social or religious community. The problem of such social practices and group-related conflicts was already known to the Apostle Paul, who dealt with group rivalry and divisive tendencies within the Christian community, especially in his first letter to the Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 8, 1-13, he deals with the problem of Christian unity in a heterogeneous community, where some were guided in their actions and decisions by knowledge and reason, while others were guided above all by their acquired timidity, their guilty conscience, and the social pressures of the majority society. In concrete terms, the question at issue was whether Christians were allowed to eat meat which, because of its unclear origin, was considered by some of the Corinthian Christians to be potentially contaminated, since some of the animals sold in the marketplaces were symbolically given to a foreign deity at slaughter. Its consumption was seen as bringing its consumer into the sphere of influence of an anti-divine power. For those with understanding among the Corinthians, the matter was clear. There is only one God, the Creator of the world and Father of Jesus Christ. There are no foreign gods. Consecrating animals to these gods for slaughter was therefore nothing more than a misconception. Religiously, their meat was completely irrelevant. Hence, Christians are allowed to buy meat of unknown origin at the market. They are free to prepare and eat without any hesitation. However, the real problem that threatened to divide the community was that the strong Corinthians, who held the basic view of monotheism, felt superior to the weak brothers and sisters, who, even as Christians, still felt bound to observe dietary taboos. Verses 2 and 3, the Apostle to the nations writes, quote, "If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him." End quote. Here, Paul differentiates between knowledge and love. At the same time, he distinguishes between true and false knowledge. The criterion of true knowledge is the love of God. True knowledge is based on his personal devotion and at the same time finds its expression in the personal devotion to the next person. For Paul, true knowledge and insight are not status justifying, but they are realized in the service to the fellow human being. In verse 9 it is written, "But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak." The possibility in principle for Christians to eat meat sacrificed to idols, which is actually harmless for the strong, is restricted by Paul on account of the necessary consideration in living together with the weak. For Paul, the liberty of the strong, which burdens the weak, is not a sign of true knowledge, but sin. True liberty for him is liberty for God, liberty as gift and task for the realization of love. The actual standard of this ethical demand is not cognition reason, but charity and the dignity of the other person. For Paul, this dignity in turn is fundamentally and once and for all based on the saving death of Jesus Christ. The question of the relationship between the new normal era and this Christian freedom is the guiding principle for my following remarks. For Paul, Christian freedom was not only a futuristic hope, its realization had ecclesiastical and social consequences. On the other hand, I am concerned with the question of the contours of the new global social normality and its practical and material aspects. This includes the general handling of crisis management in the face of an ongoing state of emergency, the individual and collective shaping of life with the coronavirus and all of the associated fears, scruples, and conflicts. Finally, I will consider the relationship between the healthy and the infected, between the vaccinated and the non-vaccinated, between the pure and the impure. These different questions do not only concern fundamental ecclesial acts and customs, such as the Eucharistic community, but also extend to all social relations, cultural techniques, values, and collective mindsets. It should be noted that the term crisis in this context is certainly not to be understood against the background of the key New Testament term krisis, judgment, and by no means implies an interpretation of the pandemic as God's historical action. In the first main part of this presentation, I will first address the concept of normality and then take a critical look at a number of future scenarios. The second main part of my presentation will contain both an attempt at building a Christological foundation of ecclesial ethics in the new normal era and some thoughts on its practical application. So, second, the current threats and restrictions in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic provoke the question of the contours of a future global reordering of social and also ecclesial relations. The question arises, is this reorganization a return to the status quo ante, or is it a new and innovative reality? But we must also ask critically, is the new normal era a promise or is it a threat? Let us first consider the concept of normality as a social mechanism of rules and action. From a sociological perspective, Normality refers to what is taken for granted in a society which no longer needs to be explained or decided upon. This concerns social norms and ideals as well as concrete behaviors of people. It is conveyed through education and socialization and provides for security competence to act between the people of a society. Normality has positive connotations as an anchor of cognition that offers orientation in the face of sudden breaks in traditions, crisis scenarios, and the questioning of what is taken for granted. Normality thus offers the most uncomplicated and comprehensive guidelines possible. Normality, however, also implies a constant evaluation and measurement of social processes and circumstances. Our idea of normality is oriented either to an ideal, to a desired state, or to the previous average. Accordingly, we can distinguish between ideal norms and statistical norms. Both the contra-representational fictional normality and the empirical normality, based on the statistical principle of the average, imply a certain model of history and a certain worldview. Essential here is the perception of history as a linear and determined, and therefore also calculable sequence of events. This sequence of events, in turn, has a beginning and it has an end. Linear thinking, acting, and linear ways of behaving corresponding to this conception of Weltgeschichte consists in the comprehensive analysis of the historical social situation and in the compilation and coordination of materials and results from the natural and life sciences as well as from the social and human sciences. Thus, this thinking and acting corresponds to the logic of means and ends. Conceived in terms of an optimism towards technological and social progress, the new normal era means the extension of the past into the future, shaped by acting, reason, and by technical, operational, and scientific planning. Or it means, at least, a return to past normality before the outbreak of the pandemic. The Zukunftsinstitut Frankfurt recently outlined 4 scenarios to describe the new normal era in terms of developments in Germany and throughout the world. These scenarios are based on 2 central basic coordinates that describe the possible directions of development in principle. First, successful relationships versus unsuccessful relationships. Optimistic versus pessimistic. And secondly, local versus global. Disconnected versus connected. Based on these coordinates and the possible developments arising from them, the 4 scenarios describe a range of consequences for society as a whole. Like all scenarios, this projection is sharpened to illustrate the expected changes, and it does not claim to be realistic. Scenario 1 is the super safe society, characterized by isolation. Society is once again clearly defining itself as a nation, because security can only be guaranteed if the geographical, legal, and all boundaries of the security zone are clearly defined. The state uses all available means to protect its citizens, even if that means stirring up deep-rooted fears and artificially scarifying food. At the same time, people use all possible open spaces to grow fruit and vegetables. The black market and barter trade flourish. Deurbanization is taking place. Rural areas are gaining power. Those who can move from the cities to the countryside. provide for themselves, and earn money from supplying impoverished city dwellers with food. The trend towards both single living and ever smaller apartments, as well as dependence on public transportation and global flows of goods, has made urban populations dependent. Urban hipsters have become a precarious class. A germophobia, a longing for sterility, is taking hold. Everything is clinically disinfected before consumption, and research into safe packaging is being carried out at full speed. Imports are being restricted out of fear that germs will be introduced via products from abroad. Agriculture and the manufacturing industry are experiencing an enormous upswing. Assemblies of more than 10 people, including religious events, remain permanently banned for the good of the people. Public cultural life has therefore come to an almost complete standstill. Church services or concerts still take place, but the audience sits at home in front of the TV or computer screen, free of charge, subsidized by the state. Public gastronomy no longer exists. Customers are consistently supplied with meals according to the highest hygienic standards via e-delivery service. For city dwellers in particular, social contacts have shifted to the virtual realm. Scenario 2 is the permanent crisis mode. The virus has sent the entire world reeling, and it can no longer rest. The focus on national interests has massively and irretrievably shaken confidence in global cooperation. Concerns about another pandemic make every local spread of a virus, no matter how small, a trigger for drastic measures, from border closures to military defense of resources. The loss of trust in international cooperation based on solidarity prevents lasting stability. Frictions in the multipolar world order, mutual recriminations, aggressive threatening gestures, and nervous actions in self-interest are the order of the day. At the same time, however, national dependence on international trade relations and flows of goods remain. Both tendencies are permanently and abruptly juxtaposed and rub up against each other. Against this background, the collecting and processing of large amounts of data is experiencing a continuous upswing. The development of artificial intelligence is being pushed, not least for the simulation of further crisis scenarios. Internally, the state is using computer technology for surveillance. Predictive analytics, the data-based prediction of human behavior, is becoming increasingly important in a permanently insecure society. Accordingly, privacy is on the retreat. Individual freedom of data is being increasingly restricted. Data protection has largely been abolished, both in international exchanges and in dealing with one's own population. Scenario 3 is characterized by a general retreat into the private sphere. People no longer believe that state actors and supranational alliances still have the power to act. The rejection of the global world community leads to particularistic and isolationist societies. Community is now sought on a small scale. Neighborly help becomes the rule. There are fixed structures for helping each other in the event of a crisis, especially in the church context. Supplies are shared or exchanged, and special consideration is given to the sick, the elderly, and the weak. Instead of using public transportation, individual mobility is experiencing a renaissance. Long-distance travel, meanwhile, has lost much of its appeal, in contrast to regional recreational areas. Long-distance travel is now less attractive also because there are numerous restrictions and precautions in post-corona times. The failure of global retail chains is leading to economic regionalization. People are buying local more than ever. The sharing economy is gaining a strong momentum in regional networks. The economy functions mostly self-sufficiently at the regional level. Home offices have become an essential part of every corporate culture. International companies arrange meetings in virtual reality conferences, and contracts are concluded via blockchains. Lastly, scenario 4. Finally, is characterized by a comprehensive adaptation, the resilient society. In this case, the coronavirus has triggered a self-cleansing of the markets. The failure of global production and trade change has led to a rediscovery of domestic alternatives. Stationary trade, regional products and supply chains have experienced an upswing. This has not only created a sensible balance between online and offline, but more importantly, a smart approach to globalized retail chains, a balance of local and global trade, and a blossoming of direct trade platforms. The monopoly position of online retailers like Amazon and Alibaba has dissolved in favor of several smaller players that are less dependent on global production chains and more readily available locally. Society is moving away from mass consumption and a throwaway mentality towards a more sustainable economic system. Health is no longer seen as something that concerns only the individual body and one's own behavior, but also relates to the environment, the place of residence, politics, the global community. Governments, urban planning and business are now cooperating to create healthy environments for all people. The use of digital health apps has become natural in this context to share real-time health data anonymously. Thanks to predictive health, accurate predictions can thus be made, for example, about the probabilities of another local epidemic. While nation-states have lost relevance, both cities and supranational entities are becoming increasingly important. Overall, since the pandemic, humanity and worldwide Christianity too perceive themselves more strongly as a global community that must solve challenges together. The 4 scenarios outlined by the Frankfurt Future Institute have in common that, on the one hand, the future of our societies according to or with COVID-19 is seen in the positive case as the perfection of existing possibilities, but in the negative case as the collapse of past structures and standards. Another common feature is that the scenarios are all guided by the maxim of adapted behavior and purposeful decision-making and acting on the part of the community and the individual. Finally, all scenarios are united by the unquestioned assumption that this behavior, this decision-making, and this action is in turn at the disposal of the thinking and planning human being, precisely because it is subject to a linear model of history and is therefore analyzable, controllable, and determinable. Experiments such as the 4 scenarios presented here simulate natural and social processes in order to make them specifically manipulable. I consider these approaches to be mistaken, if not a hybrid fallacy. I would like to give the following reasons for this. Firstly, It is fundamentally true that free human action must neither be guided in a determined way by past experiences alone, nor by the pressure of present circumstances. Every vita activa, every action of a free human being, especially in a conflict-structured society, must rather begin at the momentum that is also marked by risk and uncertainty. Secondly, only such communicative action in freedom leads to a society which is interested in more than its mere functioning. Without this freedom, science is fixed on human action alone. Without this freedom, there is security and order, but there is no human dignity. If human life can be exhaustively regulated by reason, then the possibility of life is destroyed. Thirdly, for me as a Christian, the linearly perceived history is not only the possible horizon of self-interpretation and world interpretation. Against this background, freedom, in the sense of Christian freedom, also means a new normality which is precisely not defined by the understanding of the past, but rather by hope for the future, which in turn finds its expression in this present human vita activa. It is in courageous action for the good of our fellow human beings, for the good of our nations, and for the good of all humanity. In the outlined perception of the term New Normal Era in relation to large parts of the cultural, social, and political discourses of the present, a continuous and profound secularization of Christian eschatology becomes apparent. Here, the future is withdrawn from God's disposal and placed solely in the power of humanity to dispose of it. The technocratic perception of the future as a controllable period of expectation through the social belief in progress and economic globalization is accompanied by a widespread skepticism of progress, which at the same time interprets the past ante-COVID-19 as a hoped-for state of the ideal order. Freedom is then only a freedom of basic material provision, a freedom of work, and a freedom of media entertainment. Of course, every possible future is interrelated with the feasible conditions of its realization. But the new normal era cannot simply be postulated or even commanded. This new normality with regard to our social relations, our cultural techniques, and our value systems must be able to be affirmed and accepted by each and every one of us. And we, in turn, must be fundamentally clear in all of this that all human forecasts of the future are to be regarded only as finite, penultimate purposes, and by no means as infinite or even ultimate goals of meaning. The core of Christian eschatology consists in the hope for a post-historical completion of the transient existence. From this derives a fundamental critique of the existing and a fundamental relativization of human reason in the light of this gospel. True Christian freedom therefore means an inner historical or present action and decision-making in which not only human reason but also, sometimes against appearances, the anticipatory hope for divine salvation that is promised to be realized in the future. Death is not the absolute end. Therefore, the ethical design of a new normal era must not be limited to avoiding death at all costs and under all circumstances. The future that has become hopeful in the gospel of Jesus Christ as promissio Dei, namely as a universal end of history, makes ready to recognize new beginnings in history characterized by death, guilt, failure, futility, transience, and finitude. The final purpose of this history is not the new earthly order, but God's hoped for kingdom of peace. For global Christianity, the new normal era represents both a challenge and an opportunity to become aware of this true purpose in view of the profound changes in society as a whole that COVID-19 pandemic has already triggered and will continue to bring about. It would be completely inadequate if the internal church approach to the virus were to result solely in protective measures, such as the prevention of direct interaction in congregations and the relocation of regular church services to virtual spaces on the internet, thereby abandoning liturgy based on physical presence as an indispensable practice of symbolic communication in the church. In my view, the Church's perspective on the new normal era should not only be oriented towards damage control and an adaptation of existing social conditions, but should transcend these worldly conditions from a kingdom of God perspective. The Christian belief in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of the dead provokes a new attitude towards life and death, which has consequences not only for faith, but also for interpersonal relationships and socio-political objectives. Seen in this light, the Church should not be relevant to the social system, but relevant to the kingdom of God, its and our contribution to a positive new normality after the coronavirus must therefore be prophetic on the one hand and characterized by solidarity on the other. Prophetic and solidarity. Prophetic in the sense that we must orient ourselves not solely on history, but also on the promise of God and Jesus Christ. Solidarity in the sense that with the Apostle Paul, not the discerning reason, but the love of our next and the dignity of the other person becomes the guideline for our decisions and actions in the new normal era. Thank you all for your kind attention. Gamsa Hamida.